Welcome to another reading of an interesting but unexciting Wikipedia article. It is chosen to be at that sweet spot of engaging and boring, just right to help you fall asleep. Thank you to the authors of Wikipedia for this content. It is perfectly all right. My gratitude also to the government of Norway for providing this endless, ideally unexciting video footage of a train crossing the entire country. Without further delay, let's fall asleep learning about the Mason-Dixon line, or Mason's and Dixon's line, was surveyed between 1763 and 1767 by Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon in the resolution of a border dispute involving Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Delaware in colonial America. It is a demarcation line between four U.S. states forming part of the borders of Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, and West Virginia, part of Virginia, until 1863. Later it became known informally as the border between the free northern states and the slave southern states. The Virginia portion was the northern border of the Confederacy. It came into use during the debate around the Missouri Compromise of 1820, when the border between slave and free states was an issue. It is still used today in the figurative sense of a line that separates the North and South politically and socially. Background. Maryland's Charter of 1632 granted the Calverts land north of the entire length of the Potomac River up to the 40th parallel. A problem arose when Charles II was granted a charter for Pennsylvania in 1681. The grant defined Pennsylvania's southern border as identical to Maryland's northern border, but described it differently, as Charles relied on an inaccurate map. The terms of the grant clearly indicate that Charles II and William Penn believed that the 40th parallel would intersect the 12-mile circle around Newcastle, Delaware, when in fact it falls north of the original boundaries of the city of Philadelphia, the site which Penn had already selected for his colony's capital city. Negotiations ensued after the problem was discovered in 1681. A compromise proposed by Charles II in 1682, which might have resolved the issue, was undermined by Penn receiving the additional grant of the 3 lower counties along Delaware Bay, which later became the Delaware Colony, a satellite of Pennsylvania. Maryland considered these parts of its own original grant. The conflict became more of an issue when settlement extended into the interior of the colonies. In 1732, the property governor of Maryland, Charles Calvert, 5th Baron Baltimore, signed a provisional agreement with William Penn's sons, which drew a line somewhere in between and renounced the Calvert claim to Delaware. But later, Lord Baltimore claimed that the document he had signed did not contain the terms he had agreed to and refused to put the agreement into effect. Beginning into the 1730s, violence erupted between settlers claiming various loyalties to Maryland and to Pennsylvania. The border conflict would be known as Cresap's War. Progress was made after a court of chancery ruling affirmed the 1732 agreement, but the issue remained unresolved until Frederick Calvert, 6th Baron Baltimore, ceased contesting the claims on the Maryland side and accepted the earlier agreements. Maryland's border with Delaware was to be based on the Trans-Spinular Line and the 12-mile circle around Newcastle. The Pennsylvania-Maryland border was defined as the line of latitude 15 miles south of the southernmost house in Philadelphia, on what is today South Street. As part of the settlement, the Penns and Calverts commissioned the English team of Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon to survey the newly established boundaries between the province of Pennsylvania, the province of Maryland, and Delaware Colony. In 1779, Pennsylvania and Virginia agreed to extend Mason's and Dixon's line due west, 5 degrees of longitude, to be computed from the River Delaware for the southern boundary of Pennsylvania, and that a meridian drawn from the western extremity thereof to the northern limit of said state be the western boundary of Pennsylvania forever. After Pennsylvania abolished slavery in 1781, the western part of this line and the Ohio River became a border between slave and free states, with Delaware retaining slavery until the 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865. Geography of the line. Mason and Dixon's actual survey line began to the south of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and extended from a benchmark east to the Delaware River and west to what was then the boundary with western Virginia. The surveyors also fixed the boundary between Delaware and Pennsylvania and the approximately north-south portion of the boundary between Delaware and Maryland. Most of the Delaware-Pennsylvania boundary is an arc, and the Delaware-Maryland boundary does not run truly north-south because it was intended to bisect the Delmarva Peninsula rather than follow a meridian. The Maryland-Pennsylvania boundary is an east-west line with an approximate mean latitude of 39 degrees, 43 minutes, 20 seconds north. In reality, the east-west Mason-Dixon line is not a true line in the geometric sense, but is instead a series of many adjoining line segments, following a path between latitude 39 degrees, 43 minutes, 15 seconds north, and 39 degrees, 43 minutes, 23 seconds north. The surveyors also extended the boundary line 40 miles, 64 kilometers, west of Maryland's western boundary, into territory that was still in dispute between Pennsylvania and Virginia, though this was contrary to their original charter. Mason and Dixon's survey was finished on October 9, 1767, about 31 miles, 50 kilometers east of what is now Pennsylvania's southwest corner. In 1774, commissioners from Pennsylvania and Virginia met to negotiate their boundary, which at the time involved Pennsylvania's southern border west of Maryland and its entire western border. Both sides agreed that Pennsylvania's grant made its western border a tracing of the course of the Delaware River, displaced 5 degrees, approximately 265 miles, to the west. And both sides thought this would place Fort Pitt in Virginia territory. In fact, it would not have. With that in mind, the governor of Pennsylvania argued that, despite the agreement reached with Maryland, Pennsylvania's southern border west of Maryland was still the 39th parallel, about 50 miles, 80 kilometers south of the Mason-Dixon line. Negotiations continued for 5 years with a series of proposed lines. In the end, a compromise was reached. The Mason-Dixon line would be extended west to a point 5 degrees west of the Delaware River. To compensate Pennsylvania for the claimed territory lost, its western boundary would be run due north rather than copying the course of the Delaware River. The Mason-Dixon line was marked by stones every mile and crown stones every 5 miles, 8 kilometers, using stone shipped from England. The Maryland side says M, and the Delaware and Pennsylvania sides say P. Crown stones include the 2 coats of arms. Today, while a number of the original stones are missing or buried, many are still visible, resting on public land and protected by iron cages. Mason and Dixon confirmed earlier survey work, which delineated Delaware's southern boundary from the Atlantic Ocean to the Middle Point Stone, along what is today known as the Transpinnular Line. They proceeded nearly due north from this to the Pennsylvania border. Later, the line was marked in places by additional benchmarks and survey markers. The lines have been resurveyed several times over the centuries without substantive changes to Mason's and Dixon's work. The stones may be a few to a few hundred feet east or west of the point Mason-Dixon line thought they were. In any event, the line drawn from stone to stone forms the legal boundary. According to Dave Doyle at the National Geodetic Survey, part of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the common corner of Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Delaware, at the Wedge, is marked by Boundary Monument number 87. The marker MDP corner dates from 1935 and is offset on purpose. Doyle said that the Maryland-Pennsylvania Mason-Dixon line is exactly 39 degrees, 43 minutes, 19.92216 seconds north, and boundary monument number 87 is on that parallel at 75 degrees, 47 minutes, 18.93851 seconds west. Visitors to the tri-point are strongly encouraged to first obtain permission from the nearest landowner or use the path from the Arc Corner Monument, which is bordered by Delaware parkland most of the way, and Pennsylvania parkland the entire way. History. The line was established to end a boundary dispute between the British colonies of Maryland and Pennsylvania/Delaware. Pennsylvania's grant defined the colony's southern boundary as following a 12-mile radius circle, counterclockwise from the Delaware River until it hit, quote, the beginning of the 40th degree of northern latitude, end quote. From there, the boundary was to follow the 40th parallel due west for 5 degrees of longitude. But the 40th parallel does not, in fact, intersect the 12-mile circle, instead lying significantly farther north. Thus, Pennsylvania's southern boundary as defined in its charter was contradictory and unclear. The most serious problem was that Maryland's claim would put Philadelphia, the major city in Pennsylvania, within Maryland. The dispute was peacefully resolved in 1767 when the boundary was fixed as follows. Between Maryland and Pennsylvania, the parallel latitude line, 15 miles, 24 kilometers, south of the then southernmost point in Philadelphia, measured to be at about 39 degrees, 43 minutes north, and agreed upon as the Maryland-Pennsylvania line. Between Delaware and Maryland, the existing east-west transpeninsular line from the Atlantic Ocean to the Chesapeake Bay, as far as its midpoint from the Atlantic. A 12-mile circle, 12 miles, 19 kilometers, around the city of Newcastle, Delaware. A tangent line connecting the midpoint of the transpeninsular line to the western side of the 12-mile circle. A north line along the meridian from the tangent point to the Maryland-Pennsylvania border. Should any land within the 12-mile circle fall west of the north line, it would remain part of Delaware. This was indeed the case, and this border is the Arc Line. The disputants engaged an expert British team, astronomer Charles Mason and surveyor Jeremiah Dixon, to survey what became known as the Mason-Dixon line. It cost the Calverts of Maryland and the Penns of Pennsylvania 3,512 pounds, equivalent to 455,944 pounds in 2019, to have the 244 miles, 393 kilometers, surveyed with such accuracy. To them the money was well spent, for in a new country there was no other way of establishing ownership. The Mason-Dixon line is made up of 4 segments corresponding to the terms of the settlement: the tangent line, the north line, the arc line, and the 39-degree, 43-minute north parallel. The most difficult task was fixing the tangent line, as they had to conform the accuracy of the transpeninsular line midpoint and the 12-mile circle, determine the tangent point along the circle, and then actually survey and monument the border. They then surveyed the north and arc lines. They did this work between 1763 and 1767. This actually left a small wedge of land in dispute between Delaware and Pennsylvania until 1921. In April 1765, Mason and Dixon began their survey of the more famous Maryland-Pennsylvania line. They were commissioned to run it for a distance of 5 degrees of longitude, west from the Delaware River, fixing the western boundary of Pennsylvania. However, in October 1767, at Dunkard Creek near Mount Morris, Pennsylvania, nearly 244 miles, 393 kilometers west of the Delaware, their Iroquois guides refused to go any further, having reached the border of their lands with the Lenape, with whom they were engaged in hostilities. As such, the group was forced to quit, and on October 11 they made their final observations, 233 miles, 375 kilometers, from their starting point. In 1784, surveyors David Rittenhouse and Andrew Ellicott and their crew completed the survey of the Mason-Dixon line to the southwest corner of Pennsylvania, 5 degrees from the Delaware River. Other surveyors continued west to the Ohio River. The section of the line between the southwestern corner of Pennsylvania and the river is the county line between Marshall and Wetzel counties, West Virginia. The Mason-Dixon line has been resurveyed 3 times, in 1849, 1900, and in the 1960s. On November 14, 1963, during the bicentennial of the Mason-Dixon line, U.S. President John F. Kennedy opened a newly completed section of Interstate 95 where it crossed the Maryland-Delaware border. It was one of his last public appearances before his assassination in Dallas, Texas. The Delaware Turnpike and the Maryland portion of the new road were later designated as the John F. Kennedy Memorial Highway. Systematic errors and experiments to weigh the earth. Mason and Dixon could only do the work as accurately as they did due to the work of Neville Maskelyne, some of whose instruments they used. There was keen interest in their work and much communication between the surveyors, Maskelyne, and other members of the British scientific establishment in the Royal Society in Britain, notably Henry Cavendish. During such survey work, it is normal to survey from point to point along the line and then survey back to the starting point, where, if there were no errors, the origin and resurveyed position would coincide. Normally, the return errors would be random. For example, the return survey errors compared to the intermediate points back to the start point would be spatially randomly distributed around the start point. Mason and Dixon found that there were larger than expected systematic errors, i.e. non-random errors, that led to the return survey consistently being in one direction away from the starting point. When this information got back to the Royal Society members, Henry Cavendish realized that this may have been due to the gravitational pull of the Allegheny Mountains, deflecting the theodolite plumb bobs and spirit levels. Maskelyne then proposed measuring the gravitational force causing this deflection induced by the pull of a nearby mountain upon a plumb bob in 1772, and sent Mason, who had returned to Britain, on a site survey through central England and Scotland to find a suitable location during the summer of 1773. Mason selected Schiehallion, at which to conduct what became known as the Schiehallion experiment, which was carried out primarily by Maskelyne and determined the density of the Scottish mountain. Several years later, Cavendish used a very sensitive torsion balance to carry out the Cavendish experiment and determine the average density of Earth. In culture. Name. Mason and Dixon likely never heard the phrase Mason-Dixon line. The official report on the survey, issued in 1768, did not even mention their names. While the term was used occasionally in the decades following the survey, it came into popular use when the Missouri Compromise of 1820 named Mason and Dixon's line as part of the boundary between slave territory and free territory. Symbolism. In popular usage to people from the northern United States, the Mason-Dixon line symbolizes a cultural boundary between the North and the South. However, for many people who identify as Southern, Maryland is not considered a Southern state, leading to confusion over terminology. Originally, Mason and Dixon's line referred to the border between Pennsylvania and Maryland. After Pennsylvania abolished slavery, it served as a demarcation line for the legality of slavery. That demarcation did not extend beyond Pennsylvania because Delaware, then a slave state, extended north and east of the boundary. Also lying north and east of the boundary was New Jersey, where slavery was formally abolished in 1846, but former slaves continued to be apprenticed to their masters until the passage of the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution in 1865. The Missouri Compromise line, parallel 36 degrees 30 minutes north, had a much clearer geographic connection to slavery in the United States leading up to the Civil War. In popular culture, Popular culture contains a multitude of references to the Mason-Dixon line as a general geographic division or character names evoking it, although a minority of these specifically relate to the line itself. Film. Mason, the line, Dixon is a leading character in Rocky Balboa, 2006, the sixth film in the Rocky franchise, directed by and starring Sylvester Stallone. Played by a real-life boxer, Antonio Tarver, Dixon is the current world heavyweight boxing champion who is ridiculed for having never fought a real contender and thus agrees to an exhibition fight against the nearly 60-year-old Rocky Balboa. In Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, 1978, Mason-Dixon is the leader of a government task force dedicated to stopping the World War crisis where tomatoes turn malignant. Cartoons. The line makes several appearances in the 1953 Bugs Bunny cartoon, Southern Fried Rabbit. The line separates the drought-affected North, from which the Yankee, Bugs, leaves in search of carrots in the green lands of the Dixie South, the latter being guarded by Yosemite Sam. Literature. In the novel People's Choice by John Greenfield, the character W. Dixon Mason is an African-American preacher who plays a major role in determining the next U.S. president when the elected candidate dies between the popular election and the Electoral College formal vote. Mason and Dixon, 1997, is the title of a novel by American author Thomas Picayune. The novel meanders wildly through the lives of Mason and Dixon, traditional American history, and other themes such as hollow earth theory, geomancy, deism, and perhaps alien abduction. Music. The 1918 song Rockabye Your Baby with a Dixie Melody was written by Gene Schwartz, Sam M. Lewis, and Joe Young, popularized by Al Jolson, including the lyric, "Just hang my cradle, mammy mine, right on that Mason-Dixon line." A small group of musicians from Paul Whiteman's orchestra, led by C. melody saxophonist Frank Trumbauer, and including Bix Beiderbecke, recorded two sides for Columbia on May 15, 1929, titled Alabama Snow and What a Day, under the pseudonym Mason-Dixon Orchestra. It is probable that they chose this pseudonym because the catalog number of the record would be 1861-D, 1861 being the year that the American Civil War began. The lyric, "First Across the Mason-Dixon Line," features in the opening verse of the song I've Done It Again, composers Mary Ann Faithfull, Barry Reynolds, on Grace Jones' 1981 album Night Clubbing. The 1955 song Hey Porter by Johnny Cash makes reference to the Mason-Dixon line in the line, "How much longer until we cross that Mason-Dixon line?" From the 2000 album Sailing to Philadelphia by British singer-songwriter and guitarist Mark Knopfler, the title track, also featuring James Taylor, is about the two English surveyors Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon, traveling to Philadelphia to survey the Mason-Dixon line. The lyrics draw from Mason and Dixon by Thomas Picayune, a novel about their relationship. Dan Seals sung the Mason-Dixon line, and the song symbolically references the line. GZA references the Mason-Dixon line in the closing words of his feature verse on Raekwon's song Guillotine Swords from his debut 1995 album, Only Built for Cuban Links. Tom Lehrer references the Mason-Dixon line in his song I Want to Go Back to Dixie. The song Home is Where the Heart Is on Lady Antebellum's eponymous album contains the line, It's just south of the Mason-Dixon line. The 1916 song Are You From Dixie? 'Cause I'm a Dixie Too, originally recorded by Bill Murray, contains the lyrics, If you're from Alabama, Tennessee, or Carolina, any place below the Mason-Dixon line, then you're from Dixie. The 1983 Alabama song, Dixieland Delight, contains the lyrics, Spend my dollar parked in a holler 'neath the mountain moonlight, holding her up tight, make a little lovin', a little turtle dovin' on a Mason-Dixon night. Brad Paisley, LL Cool J, and Lee Thomas Miller's infamous 2013 song, accidental racist, uses the Mason-Dixon line as a metaphor for north-south, black-white, and other cultural dysfunctional relations. Oh Dixieland, the relationship between the Mason-Dixon needs some fixin'. Sports. In the regional baseball rivalry between the New York Yankees and the Boston Red Sox, the theoretical border that separates population centers that are majority Red Sox fans from majority Yankees fans in Connecticut is sometimes called the Mason-Dixon line, in a reference to the Mason-Dixon line. Credited to Steve Rushin of Sports Illustrated, the line is named for former famed Yankee catcher Thomas Munson and Red Sox right fielder Trot Nixon. I hope you are now asleep. Thank you to the authors of Wikipedia and the Government of Norway for making your content available under the Creative Commons license to be used in this video. Please return tomorrow when you are ready to fall asleep.